Welcome to the Restoring Our City podcast. We are back with our season finale. We are wrapping up season 3, believe it or not. It's kind of incredible to think about that. There are 3 seasons of this. And this is amazing that we are still going and talking about relevant topics. And really, our tagline is having candid conversations on today's topics that really help connect our community. And I've been very fortunate to co-host this series with my good friend, Jeswin Thomas. Hello, sir.
Hey, I'm excited to be here at end of the season.
End of the season. And we're just gonna pick back up again too. But I know it's been a really cool ride. 15 plus episodes this season. We've talked about a lot and we wanted to recap some things. And we also did get some questions from our listeners as well. We wanted to address that today. But Jeswin, how are things going? How are you feeling?
It's been I feel like I've learned a ton, this specific year, especially with just thinking about things critically. I think in a world that is so divided, it's been nice to talk through some hard things, but in a very amicable way.
That's a good lesson to know, especially if you're going to get married in a few weeks. Shout out to Jeswin and Stephanie for getting married in a couple weeks. So good skill to have to think through things. But you're also always wrong, Jeswin. Just remember that you're always wrong.
So I've heard. I'll challenge that idea critically. We'll use the outline, but it's
Get
okay.
some stats. Get some stats. So, Jeswin, I mean, we've tackled quite a bit of topics, and then shout out to my fellow colleagues as well: Josh, Alvin, Toby, Sibby, Joel, everybody. Toby. We've talked about a lot of different topics this whole entire year, from finances to cancel culture, and to some really great interviews as well. And so I really appreciate what the community is doing. Our South Asian Christian community is doing some awesome things. And I love the wisdom that's coming out of, the people that we are just friends with in our community. So shout out to everybody for what you do. This specific series we've been talking about in the last several episodes, critically thinking about blank. And then we are inserting a controversial topic, right? And Jeswin, if you had to just kind of reflect, right? What are some of those standout moments from the season for you?
I think for me, what stands out is just how much I learned. We were talking about leaving Afghanistan as one of the episodes in this series, and just considering, the toll that it's taken on American lives. And the first thing that always comes to my mind is, well, how many lives were just lost as a direct result of the war with our servicemen and women that are out there? But one thing I never considered is, well, how about the peripheral costs of when they come back home and they don't have access to mental health services and they're not cared for? How many tens of thousands of people have died? It's just a number that we don't talk about when we think about these stats. So that was something that has always just stood in the back of my mind ever since we talked about that topic.
Yeah, that's a good one. And you know what? Shout out to all of our listeners too. I've gotten feedback. I think one of the number one requests that we've gotten, and we want to do some research on this before we just present a series, is, hey, you guys should talk about mental health. And I know there's been a lot of like great churches and webinars and series and fellow content creators that I've seen who've done some really great work. We definitely want to talk about that as well. Mental health is so huge. And so I think I remember when you mentioned that on that last episode, Jasmine, it's like, it's incredible to think about the people who are still suffering as a result of the war coming back when they're outside of combat, right? But the mental health just topic as a whole, we've actually touched on it quite a bit this series with several of our interviews and several folks just, who've normalized getting help, getting mental help and regular counseling and things like that. And that is a great, healthy thing to do. So definitely something we're going to be talking about in the next season as well. Standout moments for me, I think it's been awesome to connect with so many people. We were at the same wedding in New York. Shout out Remo, getting married. We were out there hanging out, and random people that I've met, from New York to California to Chattanooga, like people are like, hey, I heard the podcast. It was awesome. And I, really enjoyed it and learned some great things. And so I think that was the standout moments for me, just randomly meeting people who have listened. And so, but also
shout out to all of you guys.
All of the listeners, we appreciate you guys. And we are going to be sharing some of the questions that you guys have shared But just this topic of critically thinking, like, how do you think that's helped you as we've kind of learned together through these couple episodes? How do you think that's helped you in your everyday life?
To be honest, I would say that toward the beginning of this year, I feel like maybe I was in my own little echo chamber, just around people that would affirm the things I already believed to be true. Watching news media outlets that already just affirmed what I believe to be true. But I think this past year, when I started just seeing the world and how divided it was on a whole slew of topics, and even things that we ought not to be divided on. We're just making divisions for the sake of belonging to our own ideological tribe. I think, what critically thinking this series has done for me is, at the very least, be able to have a topic and potentially take a stance that might not be as mainstream, and at least have the courage to say, "Hey, I will get behind this idea. I believe it to be true. I don't think it's necessarily popular, but once we have looked at it and really thought through it, I'm not afraid to share my opinion and say this is where I stand."
That's awesome, and that's brave too, right? Like it's really tough to really put yourself out there and say this is what I believe. And with the news too, it changes every day, and you get a different take and a different story that you may not have seen before. And I think that's awesome. I feel the same way. It's really great to see topics outside of your political ideology, but really looking at things from a unbiased perspective as much as you can, right? To get out of the
Right.
echo chamber.
No, it's really funny because just for the listeners that are out there, before a couple of these episodes, Jobin and myself would really talk about, do we really want
Right.
to do this? Because we can anticipate, well, people may not agree. You might get pushback, but at the same time, I'm glad that we took some time and really talked through a lot of the topics that we did.
Yeah, and I think speaking of that, you know, what are some of the pushbacks? What are some of the pieces of feedback that you and I have heard? Maybe we could share that with our listeners because we not everybody agrees with everything that we put out, which is we kind of knew that going in. But at the same time, it's okay to hear that, and I actually really appreciate that people are okay with sharing their opinions, whether it might not align with whether it aligns or not with what we have actually presented, right?
Yeah, so some of the feedback that I could recall, at least, kind of thinking through, maybe way toward the beginning of the season, we had done a webinar, and really the thing that really kicked off this entire series was it came from that webinar, and it was titled "Critically Thinking About Being Woke," and really thinking through critical race theory and its applications. And we had the privilege of hosting Dr. Neil Shenvi there. And I remember one of the pieces of feedback that we received and we had to think through is, well, have you guys ever considered that the origins of CRT actually comes from like a legal framework? And it's something that wasn't brought up in the webinar, but something that helped us to dive even deeper and consider, well, let's think through what the implications of that is. And I remember after our vaccine episode, we had some feedback to consider, and someone had brought up, well, have you considered the fact that more people might have died from taking this potential vaccine than most of the vaccines that are out there on the market for the past X number of years? And once again, we had to do a little bit of a deep dive to be like, well, we never considered that. Let's think about what that means. So it just shows you that we have not thought about these topics exhaustively. And there are many thoughts that are out there, and we still need to learn. And we appreciate those people that have given us that feedback so that we can dive deeper.
Yeah, I didn't realize I was going to do some research on horse tranquilizers and if they are going to be effective. No, all kidding aside, I feel like they're in a 20-minute or 30-minute or 40-minute episode. Are you going to get through all the medical research? Probably not. But we're okay with that, and we are actually open to hearing feedback, and we totally appreciate that. And it's really, you should be looking at the experts to make a decision, but we should be talking about these things.
Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah,
I was going to say, if anything, I appreciate that this is not necessarily an exhaustive conversation, but rather a conversation starter. We love to have
yeah.
continuing conversations with you on these topics. So rather than just talking to Jobin and Jobin just talking to me, we love to have those conversations with you. And honestly, that might be a standout moment for me as well. Kind of going back to that first question, is just continuing that conversation.
Yeah, yeah. And you know what? It's kind of like we've talked about this because it isn't just a conversation to come to an end conclusion, right? It's more conversation starter. Let's actually not be polarizing. And I think our little tagline for this
Hmm.
was less arguing, more analyzing. And I really appreciate everybody who shared feedback, did it in love and like shared, hey,
Yeah.
what do you have you thought about this? And we didn't argue. And I think that's actually one of the pieces of I think maybe it's feedback, but I've learned from the feedback was that, you know what, there is hope out there, even though we are in a polarized kind of nation and society right now. You can still have your own opinions, right? That shouldn't mean you should
Right.
be this like moderate, ambiguous, like I'm going to be this fence sitter who doesn't have any call on anything. I don't care. I'm going to live in my bubble. You should have strong opinions on things, but the way you
Absolutely.
communicate it is really important as
Yeah.
well. If you're part of the body of Christ, right?
Absolutely.
You mentioned some of the updates and some of those things that we've talked about in the past. Just as a recap, I mean, we kicked this off with, the idea sparked with that webinar, critically thinking about being woke with Dr. Neil Shenvi. It's a really great webinar to hear, and a lot of good information. And we got some great feedback. We had so many people watch it on YouTube and provide feedback and even questions during the actual event. Um, Maybe let's talk about some of those things. I mean, when we talk about CRT, we had that webinar back, I think, in April, and now it's September. And the news it seems like it's really sprung up conversations about CRT in the world, in society, and like in Texas, I think they've tried to ban any
Hmm.
teaching of critical race theory in the school system, and there's a lot of pushback and things like that. So we've heard a lot of feedback and people sharing different resources. I think one thing that I've constantly heard, we got some negative feedback too. People have said, "Hey, this is whack. This is completely bogus," um, or "Why haven't you looked at this?" And one thing that I always try to go back to is, are we commenting on the ideas or the people presenting the ideas? We're like, oh, you
Hmm.
don't have the right credentials, or why didn't you talk about this? But why aren't we talking about the actual ideas
Hmm.
themselves and criticizing them if they're right or wrong? Because I think that's the crux of the issue of what people are bringing up. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, but that's what I've seen about CRT lately. And there's lots of history behind it too, and there's aspects that might be good, which is
Sure.
great, but that's typically not the main question that we're trying to tackle. And it seems like, especially Christian leaders, I'll say from what I've seen, they always avoid it. They always avoid the, well, if is there something negative about it, well, then they talk about something else, like talk about
Right.
credentials and talk about history. And it's like, well, talk about the idea, right?
Yeah.
But
And sometimes, Jobin, just coming back to CRT in general, I don't know where everyone in our audience lands on it specifically, but I do realize we live in a world that still has racial tensions and racial
yeah,
issues, and it is definitely not something that we can ignore or avoid. But I recall hearing this analogy, which I really liked, and it comes from the story of David, and when he had a daughter that was raped, and his son Absalom comes to him and says, "Hey, we have to deal with this injustice," and David chose not to. Right, and in the same way, later on, what occurs is Absalom goes after David, and his position as king, and we know how that story sort of ends. But kind of the principle that came out of that I've had to at least wrestle with when thinking about solutions to tackling the injustices of our world is not every solution is necessarily a solution that's going to uh, be correct in tackling a real injustice. Right,
right,
we have to make sure that we keep that lens of let's critically at least think through the solutions, and maybe sometimes getting it right, and implementing the right thing is better than doing something that's going to bring more harm in the long run.
yeah, yeah. And I think that's a really wise way to look at things too, right? We don't want to just jump towards what might be the trendy thing, or that's just disruptive to another political party or whatever the opposing people. Why can't we look at things to address issues right now? And not to say that like the social justice issue isn't a serious issue, because then we get into this ranking thing, right? Like, hey, why don't we tackle this? Or why don't we tackle world hunger? Well, why don't we tackle malaria? I mean, so what are we talking about here? We really have to talk about the ideas and focus on the actual argument, which I think this critically thinking approach helps us do, right? Like
Hmm.
defining the idea and the question and then, breaking it down as well. But there are a lot of other topics that we've talked about too. I mean, the vaccine, I think, was a hot one. We've talked
Yep.
about this from last season to this season, and we've still lived in this crazy world of COVID and these variants. You mentioned the kind of feedback that we've seen, and I think now another evolution as updates since we've published that is a lot of employers have started to evolve their policies.
Hmm.
Haven't you seen that in the workplace?
Yeah, what's funny is at the time that we filmed the episode, I believe we brought a stat into it to say only a handful of states have banned employers from requiring vaccination proof to their employees. But now we're seeing a federal mandate, especially coming from the president. And I know it's a controversial thing that's been out there to require employers that have over 100 employees to require their employees to be vaccinated and or require weekly testing and potentially face penalties. um, and on top of that, also requiring all federal employees to be vaccinated. Now, once again, with that update, I think one thing that we critically thought about and we talked about is uh, even though we may be for vaccinations. I personally, I hope that you get it out of your own volition after looking at things. There is something to be said about the dangers of setting a precedent to say, we're just going to do this and we're going to determine what is best for you. Now, even though this is an issue where I will side and say, hey, it's best that we all hopefully get the vaccine after looking at all the arguments and all the data. But I am concerned about saying, what's the next thing that's going to come and say, hey, this is best for you. Therefore, without your consent, you have to do this to be part of society.
Yeah, and get a booster shot and some of those things. I think there is another part of the conversation which is um not only whether the vaccine is the right choice to take or not. Something that evolved out of that is the whole question of mandates, right? And setting these precedents like you mentioned. And so I think that is definitely a valid conversation that people should have and should start to have and talk through where you land there. You could agree with getting a vaccine and then talking through mandates as well and setting a precedent. um, yeah, so really interesting. One of the other, I think, big news stories that we've covered was Afghanistan. That was our latest episode, and we got a lot of great conversations because, especially with the timing of 9/11 and the 20th anniversary of that, and we ended, this war in Afghanistan after so many years.
Mm.
um, I appreciate all the listeners who share their feedback about, where they were on 9/11 and just the vast experiences and ages and scenarios that we saw. And I think it's incredible to think about where we are now, but just the method of how we pulled out. I know there's been news updates since we recorded that, and the news just changes like that. Um, and there was an attack on the Kabul airport, and then the U.S. responded with a drone strike. And
Hmm.
they actually found after an investigation that they actually killed an aid worker and 9 members of his family.
Mm.
And there were actually
Wow.
7 children in that drone strike. And the conversations were very polarized about just the decision of leaving Afghanistan. However, it's like, people wanted to align themselves with a president or a political party and just, hey, I'm going to stick with them and not criticize them for what they did. But then, like, we have to look at some of these incidents individually, right? Like, especially that one, which I thought was really important to review even after the fact, right?
Mm.
So, whether that changes your mind about how we left or not, it's important to critically think about these things and take things holistically into account. So,
Absolutely. And I think it's one of the things you brought out in that episode, Jobin, where you said, we hope that your party or the way that you've been polarized in one side or the other doesn't affect how you see humans and your fellow citizens and just people in general, right? I think if we can start with getting a correct worldview on humanity first, it will really help us to see people as they are rather than through the lens of a political ideology.
no, totally. And I think that's important, especially as Christians. And, there's a lot of talk and a lot of great, like, content out there that's really helping de-escalate these really tension-filled conversations to help us not think very polarized and one-sided. Um, I think we've heard a lot from our listeners, and we asked and encouraged several folks to share your questions with us. And we did get several questions via our Ask Me Anything link. It's on our website at restoringourcity.org. We're going to keep that up there. So whenever you have a question on things that we've covered in the past or just things that you want to see us cover in the future, we'll leave that up there so you can ask your anonymous questions. And we did get quite a few, and we're not going to obviously go into stats and research today on these, but I thought it would be really cool to kind of go through some of these questions.
Mhm.
And one great one that I think we got as a result of a prior episode on critically thinking about arranged marriages
Sure.
was a question from a listener who said, do you have any advice or resources for children and families with an invisible divorce? And we've kind of talked about that concept of invisible divorce, especially in South Asian communities, where if you haven't heard that episode, the invisible divorce is where people stay together, but they are really drifting apart relationally. And we got that question from a listener. What was kind of your response when you first saw that question?
That is such an excellent question that um I haven't thought through completely, to be honest. But
Yeah,
one thing that definitely comes to mind is um it's really how do we care for these children, right? And
yeah,
in what ways can we do it? And part of that, when I think about it in the context of a South Asian community more specifically, with this concept of invisible divorces, would be that a lot of the people that I also look up to and are close with, outside of the realm of just my parents, really came from my church community. I mean, you're a prime example, Job, and sitting here, our relationship spans for a couple decades now and has continued. But there are people out there that I hope that children and families can get connected to, so that these kids aren't without people that will look out for their their best interests and their growth. So hopefully, a solid church community can help, and I hope that churches are actually not just concerned about bigger buildings, better parking lots,
yeah.
better programs, but it really tackling some of these issues and seeing how can we make an impact where it will matter for the future.
Yeah, I think that's well said because my mind gravitated towards your church community and just being a part of some people who can actually hear your issue, right, and like talk to somebody you could trust. And there might be very vague scenarios. We don't know where this question originated from or anything. It's totally anonymous. So depending on your age and things like that, find people you can talk to, right?
Yeah.
We've talked about mental health a little bit, but I cannot stress that enough. Find people you can talk to share your concerns and questions, depending on the gravity of the situation. And then really get some of those folks that kind of help talk through some of your concerns. And if you do need to get professional help and therapy and counseling, or even just talking with church leaders and mentors and a discipler, that's where some of those things can kind of help you in. And there's professional resources out there too. But, my suggestion too is, find people you can trust and talk to them about your situation. Don't go through some of those things alone. Because there should be a church community around you that can really look out for your best interest, like you said.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting questions here that I don't think we're able to go through all the details on, but really, I will say this: some of these questions we definitely want to do some future episodes on. I think one question here said, "How should I approach people who refuse to take the vaccine?" Um,
That
Interesting one.
is such a hard one to answer. Um, one thing we will say is, even though we may have talked about that episode with taking the vaccinations or not and trying to look through the stats, I believe we both at the end of the day kind of played our cards on the table and said, hey, we kind of stand with taking the vaccination based on the data and things that we've thought about, even though we don't want to dehumanize a person of the other opinion. And I
Mhm.
think that approach still stands here, right?
Yeah.
How do we, still maintain the humanity of another individual that refuses to take the vaccine or may align where you don't. I think that's one question. But then two, it's also understanding that our choices do have consequences, right? And me as uh maybe if in the future, if I had a family and had children and I was concerned about their safety, and I was known to be around an individual that didn't take the vaccine, we should also understand that you have to decide where you're comfortable, and respectfully so just say, hey, even if you have the right to your decision, but it will impact our relationship in the ways that we can hang out potentially, because I do have other things that are on my mind, and that should be valid too, right?
Yep. I was gonna say just FaceTime them. Don't approach them. Just kidding. Just kidding.
Send them a text.
Right. I'm just kidding. Yeah, I think it's a good question, and talking through it with them respectfully and in love. But we all have our convictions too, so it's a good question. Um, this next one, we got a couple questions on this,
Hmm.
and I think this is a hot button issue, which I saw a bunch of people post on social media their respective opinions. But this is the question we got. What's your stance on the abortion bills? And we got another question that said, how should Christians respond to the new Texas abortion law? Um,
This is for sure an episode that we should do. I think we would do you the service of just answering this off the cuff, but it is something that we have to look into very critically, because we understand that, of course, the general stance of just saying, well, if you're Christian and pro-life, then you have to be against all this stuff, but also understanding that, hey, on the flip side, there are complex issues that we need to also look into and understand as well, of why do people potentially turn to these solutions for real problems that exist in people's lives. We can't dehumanize that side as well, and we have to look into this. And I would love to,
yeah,
if there's anyone out there that believes that they have a very well-rounded perspective on this, I would want to jump into this conversation. Absolutely, the floor is open. We would
yep.
love that, and we definitely need to do an episode on this.
Oh yeah, and I think it would be a disservice if it's just two dudes talking about abortion. I think we love the
Yep.
female perspective, and I know we have a lot of great female listeners, and we've gotten some great input and conversations from our community on really various topics. I know this is a sensitive one too, right? And this is it's something. I mean, not to like completely go around that subject. When we look at it from a biblical perspective, that's a perspective we have to look at to say, hey, are we talking about a moral argument here? Are we talking about a legal argument too, right? There's components, and I did read the entire law
Oh
when it
wow.
came out. I literally went to the Texas State Department's site and read the entire law. And there's like some things in there where, my stance on abortion is like, I'm not, for abortion. I'm pro-life in that sense. And, am I up to date on all the nuances? Probably not. But, in research and what I've read through, especially from a moral and philosophical point of view, it's like, man, this is wrong. How could we condone killing a human being? But
Hmm.
um, I know there's lots of strong opinions out there, and they're not looking at it necessarily from that perspective. And so
Hmm.
I think it's definitely something to critically think about, but not only just from a human aspect, but like as a Christian, right? Like I can't just remove myself and that from my identity. That's some of the questions maybe that I'm just pouring onto that episode.
Right.
But I think it'd be really interesting to kind of talk through that, and he actually hear people's feedback. So if you're listening out there and you want to ask questions anonymously, you totally could do that. Um, so yeah, that we won't dive into that one right now. So I think we got a couple other questions. Here's another one that I think was interesting. Do you think the Indian church has gotten healthier or worse over time?
Hmm. You know, what would be interesting is to once again have maybe a panel like discussion for that episode. But I am so curious to understand, where do we even get stats to go for or against an opinion here? Who has aggregated Indian church related stat data? I'm not
Man, we
sure.
can't even count the offering money. Come on now. That's it's like, well, how many of you actually left and how many of you stayed? No,
I'd be
it's interesting.
curious. I mean, I would love to I would literally love to do research on that topic.
I think it would be interesting to see if it's from a. I know we have a lot of South Asian listeners, but I know Pew Research does a lot of great research on church
Mhm,
dynamics and Barna Group and lots of different entities out there. And there is this trend of people leaving the church, right? I think
mhm,
that's not any kind of secret, but especially in that South Asian church, I
mhm.
am curious, especially from our listeners who have maybe grown up in that environment. Are you still part of it? Maybe that's a poll question that we'll throw up there. Um,
Yeah. And what's interesting too is just thinking about South Asian culture in general, religion and your sort of family and everything is so intertwined together. And also understanding the Indian church isn't just a kind of like a monolith. Of course, we got so many different varieties here, whether you're going to talk about the Kanak community, the Catholic community, the Orthodox community, Martha community. It's so ingrained into the Pentecostal community. Um, and how do we actually understand each one of those things individually rather than monolithically?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. So, we'd definitely love to hear people's feedback and thoughts on that. Um, and I think finally, there's this other question here that came up. I think we started to touch on it a little bit, but what do you think about the future of education for kids in the U.S.? Um,
That's a loaded question.
yeah, that
I
is a
think
loaded
we
question.
we we touched about that a little bit with the CRT updates that you gave,
Mhm.
Jobin, and to be honest, I think it's something that as I'm approaching marriage here too, Stephanie and I have definitely talked about just thinking about the future as well, and I think we kind of have two perspectives on it. One is as Christians we're not going to be immune from being part of the world and society. So
Mm.
of course there is part of us that thinks, hey, we're not just gonna remove our children from a public school education just because we disagree with certain aspects of things that are going on. On the flip side of that argument too, it's, well, do we feel like our children are getting educated or indoctrinated? And I think that's another
Mm.
hard part to consider. And so, at least thinking through, hey, at the end of the day, I feel like our primary call is to really nurture the next generation of people that will bring the gospel into this world. So how do we supplement their education with things within the home, within our church community, and even maybe the right decision for you and for us in the future is maybe homeschooling, maybe private school. We don't know, but again, that is such a loaded topic that we have to look at from so many different angles.
Oh yeah, I have a 2-year-old in daycare, and they send me notes on the books that they're reading, and some of those made my head scratch a little bit. And it made me start to think about that question too. I think that question is more, I don't know, it's a little bit more broad, but
Hmm.
yeah, we could be talking about CRT, we could be talking about gender identity and gender
Mm,
roles.
hmm.
And we could be talking about so many things that, this culture is throwing at kids, no matter how young they are, and they can absorb that. And as a Christian, where do we fall in that? We both live in Chicago, and our perspective might be different than somebody in Texas or California or New York, right? It's like, where do you fall in that? And like, how do we approach raising our kids, especially educating them in the fear of God, and then like helping them understand what the gospel truly is, um, without shoving it down their throats, where it's just like this, you know,
Hmm.
mandated thing too, right?
Yeah.
It's a real weird balance that myself as a young parent who has just one kid, I have no idea. And so I'd love
Yeah.
to hear from seasoned veteran parents, and just people who've navigated through that. But the world is ever evolving too, right?
Yeah. And once again, I think, one of the reasons why we started this entire series on critically thinking is to be less divisive.
Yeah.
But I think it's so interesting to see how the political divisiveness impacts education for a group of children that don't affiliate to a political party right now.
They don't vote yet. But it's
Right?
like you nurture them to that, right? Like,
Hmm.
I'm guilty because I put a Chicago Bears jersey on my son today for sports day. And okay, well, he has no idea. And he was just like, jersey. And I'm like, no, no, no. Yes, you will like
Yep.
the Chicago
As
Bears.
long as it's not the Cowboys. Sorry
Yes.
for all the Dallas listeners here.
Sorry. Um, America's team. Maybe that's another episode too. Speaking of future episodes, is America's team really the Cowboys? I mean, the Bears have the most like Hall of Famers, I think, in history, right? And like they have this. I'm just nudging you a little bit.
Yeah, you don't need to critically think. The stats are out there. It's definitive.
There are some subjects you don't have to critically think about. Oh man, gonna get in trouble with that one. So with that, there are some topics I think we've alluded to, some things that we do want to talk about in future episodes. I'm looking forward to the next season and just new episodes. So we'll probably take a bit of a break, but we'll be listening for some engaged feedback from our listeners and like just new content coming your way. And especially if you have folks who are experts in our community who want to talk about this, feel free to send them our way, and we will set that up as well. So is there anything you're excited to talk about next season?
Honestly, I think the thing that I'm most excited about is just understanding this initial season was a conversation starter. Now I am excited to continue this conversation with you. And just like Jobbin said, if there are people that are passionate and well-versed and can think about a certain topic that we brought up critically and comprehensively, we want your voice to be heard. So I am excited to continue the conversation with you.
Yep. We are super excited. So check us out at restoringourcity.org. You can find all the links there. Click that Ask Me Anything button, and then you can submit an anonymous question. If you want to be brave and share a recording like our hotline, you can go to anchor.fm/restoringourcity and you can leave us a message if you so choose. You could totally do that. But we also get like DMs and messages on our social media handles at Instagram and Facebook at Restoring Our City, as well as Twitter at The Rock Podcast. We'd love to like share some clips and stuff there. Jeswin, I'm super excited about this upcoming season. Thank you for just you being so engaged and like doing a lot of research too and data dumping. Of course.
Anytime. I am pumped, and I think the next time we might record will be post marriage. So
yeah, we can.
I guess the last time recording something as a single person.
I know, right? So we are going to take a little bit of break, celebrate Jeswin, and then we'll be back to doing some more math problems and getting some data out here.
Been preparing,
and we're going to have more conversations about various topics as well. So, Jeswin, thank you so much, man. I appreciate
you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah. All right, congrats. Wrapping up season 3 and on to season 4 soon.
See y'all next time.
See you guys.